Well, I am so glad to be here today. Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Meacie Fairfax. I'm a strategy director based in Burlington, Vermont. I work for Complete College America, where our goal is to increase the number of students and learners who are attaining college completion, whether that's for a credential or value or a degree.
How'd you get into this work? It's such a fascinating mission that you all have, and you're doing some really incredible stuff.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this short because it's a long, kind of windy road. What I will say is that I was the youngest of four. I grew up in a place that was kind of between rural and urban, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the bigger thing for me is that I had, and those around me had issues with getting to and through college. I did not realize until I was kind of seeking ways to improve community outcomes and was thinking about health outcomes, was thinking about education, which we know is a social determinant for health, greater health outcomes. And it was quite frankly just through conversations, mentorship, and opportunities that I found my path here. But I would say that the turning point for me as I was working for an executive search firm based out of Boston. And what they would do is basically search committees, mission aligned institutions, and, at that point, I thought maybe it wasn't just about putting the right leader in place. But since then, I've understood that this has to be really community led and community formed. We have to learn from everybody who was a stakeholder within our education, higher education communities. And quite frankly, I was one of the students who hit every one of the barriers that we talk about at CCA in terms of strategies to make sure that students can not only get through, but persist and then thrive and get into a meaningful career. So for me, this is a mix of personal and professional.
Yeah. Well, and that's awesome. Can you break down like what the challenges are in terms of the completion? And I think you have 18 that you sort of work on a complete college in America. Can you give a quick overview of that?
Absolutely. So, more broadly, when we think about students and the ways that they think about whether they are going to be college bound or college going, it starts really early in their education. Sometimes folks will say that's like third or maybe fifth or sixth grade. And so, a lot of times, folks have already made up their mind whether they are part of that population. And a lot of that is made through what were the conversations that are happening in classrooms, whether we are math savvy, right?
Mm,
I'm not a math person. You also see it in different ways in terms of communities, right? There's many folks, I represent the Gen X of those who have gone through college with some college no degree, failed, stopped out, didn't have those supports. And so much of that was because they haven't tied it back to meaningful supports that we know that all of our
mm.
students need. They haven't tied to making sure that they understand what it is needed to continue with financial aid, to make sure that folks have the momentum and understand that doing 12 credits a semester isn't exactly going to get you through in 4 years. And then
Yeah.
thinking about many who are doing part time. What does it
Mhm.
look like for those pathways? How do we make sure that they understand what that is? But then, more largely and more broadly, there's been a lot said in the news and then just more broadly that folks are trying to look for meaning and belonging, understand
Mm.
purpose. What am I learning? What am I getting out of this degree? And is it going to propel me into a better career? We saw so much of that across the pandemic, and we never really answered those questions for folks, and folks are still grappling for that. And then at the same time, too, we realized that we are having a decline in high school enrollments.
Mm.
So that means that when we're looking to serve those we most likely have not served well. And so we have to be very clear about what that looks like. And so going back to Complete College America in terms of the body of work that we do, we have four different pillars across 18 strategies. So we talk about purpose, right, in terms of what is it that connecting your goal to your career, your aspirations for economic mobility, the momentum that I talked on. So where and how are we being clear about those pathways, providing clarity for students? What does it look like for support? So many more of us, affordability is such a concern. More than 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So that's a huge concern. And then also making sure that we understand the structure and the pathways and the different ways to get to where folks are getting to. More often than not, we know, especially with corporate entities entering into this education space, folks are looking for things that are digestible and consumable. So maybe stackable credentials leading up to further degrees or across someone's lifetime. And so we think more broadly about what is the lifetime learning that we can support for our communities and for those who are looking for different opportunities or for career changes.
I love that answer. I love how holistic you are in terms of sort of looking at all these interconnected pieces. One thing that you've mentioned a few times is that sort of like broader purpose and then the sort of the meaning behind it. What's that look like from a sort of implementation piece for you all? Because it's like that's such a
Yeah.
tricky one. And you're doing work that sort of focused on this sort of like this region, state, national levels. But then it's institution focused. You have this like really sort of holistic piece. What's that look like in practice in terms of like how you support that?
Yeah, I would say, a lot of information I like to pull from the folks who are doing work over at Gallup because I think it's really interesting in terms of perceptions
Yeah.
and whether folks are prepared for the workforce, whether they have those critical skills. And so when I think a bit about the purpose piece, I think about it, there's a duality, but then there's also a pluralistic piece to it too. So I think about so often we say to folks, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah. Totally.
I feel like we're asking the wrong questions. What's the change you want to be? What is it
Mm,
that you're seeing that's a need within your community? So many
mm,
of our folks are place based or want to be able to contribute to that. We talk more broadly about when we talk about implementation, we talk about where do we bring opportunity to explore what our interests,
mm.
the career opportunities that are available. I am what? Well, I was about to give my age, but I still talk about the the jobs, the careers that I still learn about that I have never heard of or that even potentially existed. And I think that's the other part of widening up for students so that they have more of an informed choice and they're not
Mm.
kind of siloed into choices. Because when we think about when and how students and learners get into college, so many of them is like, well, I have to go, or it's an expectation, but at the same time, on the other side are those who are, I'm not so sure about what my options are available to me. And then we also know that they narrow very, very quickly in terms of what their
Yeah.
options are available in terms of neighbors, family members, and others. And so we want there to be a broader opportunity for there to be an exploration and then for them to be more mindful, more part of that. And so that is part of the curriculum every step of the way. So it's not just a first
Wow.
year experience. It's not just talked about orientation. It's not safe to talk about when I was in college at the end and like a snap, I got to get out and I got to figure out what exactly I'm going to do. Like we're not at those moments anymore. We shouldn't be.
Yeah. That makes all sense to me. And coming from a similar place to you, right? Binghamton, New York, with very similar Harrisburg. It's like you have this tiny, tiny sliver of idea of what careers are that are completely based on like your neighborhood, your sub area, like all of this kind of thing. So I love that sort of all those through lines that you have to sort of like figuring out the sort of bigger thing and broadening your horizons. And also like the what change do you want to see? I think is such a powerful reframe for helping people see like what are some possibilities that you could sort of have and what's the sort of larger purpose that is sort of connected to that. You have some really cool emphasis in your frame on the CCA frameworks around those early momentum metrics for institutions and for students. Can you walk us through what those are?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest ones I would say that we always talk through and that we're like, come on, folks, change, change, change is gateway courses and gateway success, right? So we
Yeah.
talk about passing college level math and English in year one. We know those are powerful predictors in terms of throughputs for those who make it to college completion. However, we know that enough people don't take a look at those or understand what barriers those are for students.
Mm,
I personally, right, when I talk about this as a mix of personal and professional, we also see there's a difference when people move between institutions. So you're at a community college, you get placed into dev ed, but then you go to a 4 year college who does not put you into that place or that placement, but they put you into a 4 year, and there isn't consistency in terms of what that
mm,
looks like. And so that's another one where we talk really broadly was like, what are the bottlenecks? So even when we're talking about math and English, but then more broadly, what are the other bottlenecks that we're seeing that are that your institutions need to take a broader look at. I think the other one that we talk about is that's the credit accumulation, right? How do we make sure even, and let's be clear, like we stepped away from the 15 to finish, right? Because we realized that was a very narrow pathway for a very narrow population of students. So what we
mm,
say is, and what the research shows us is take one more class, right? When can you take one more class? What would that look like to add it to your schedule? But then also that adds for our institutions to be more perceptive and understanding of our students in terms of the different times and the availability for them, right? I think the
Mhm.
hot spots for most students or for when faculty like to schedule is Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? Usually
Completely.
in the mornings. But we have to think about how do we make it flexible for students who have multiple lives, multiple responsibilities, caregiving responsibilities, etc.
Yeah. I love that answer. What are the gaps you see in terms of that sort of like the data collection on the front end and then like that actual sort of equity centered action? I thought that's like such a powerful example there of like, you have these like this is convenient for one person, but it's, it doesn't really sort of work for the person that has these sort of layered responsibilities. What are other sort of gaps that you see
Yeah, well, I would say that when we're thinking about that too, and like a shout out to our IR folks, right? Because they are doing the work of so many, and then also trying to improve the data literacy of their colleagues, right? So they can make these changes. And so when I think more largely about what does that look like, what could it be, what are kind of the hesitations, we got to think about the data that actually is actionable and allows us to make changes, in the moment, within a semester or for the next semester or term, depending on how colleges are situated. And so it has to be timely and it has to provide insights that are not only good for disaggregated populations, but aggregate populations and also inform resource allocation. And so that's the larger piece that, when we think about strategic finance and the use of our dollars to either fund completion, we have to think more broadly about what could that look like to make our education, our institutions, our faculty, our staff much more nimble to respond to what they're seeing in the data.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Do you find there's like I know you all do some really sort of comprehensive work across state systems and institutions. Are there under leveraged policy mechanisms or funding mechanisms that you think could be sort of better used?
Well, I mean, I think that's tough, right? Because I think there's
So
a lot of things that come up that are unfunded mandates, right? So in terms of the state of that pie and what that looks like, the other thing I'd also mention is that we've seen state funding has changed dramatically over the last decades, and so that is a concern as well. I think there are policy levers, but quite frankly, part of it and part of the work that we do is educating, but then also advocating. And so when I think about policy levers, I think largely more about completion funding, and I think about getting to that point of where we are actually funding success and what does it look like to fund at that level. As someone who's really always worked in the student support space for so long and was a beneficiary of the trio services, right? Really intensive. I always realized that many more students could benefit from that, but the fundings and the dollars weren't available. The other part I also think about as a policy lens is like this: none of the challenges that we're facing in higher education are isolated to just our area, our field. And so we talk so broadly about partnerships, but in terms of actually getting really capital BP with partnerships, right? And I say B almost like buddy, like let's become really good friends and let's work together. And so what does that look like in terms of when we're using folks to support us with mental health supports, with
Mhm.
social services supports, with curriculum development and looking in terms of teaching and learning. So much is happening within the digital learning space. So much is happening with AI, which I know we'll get to talk to a little bit more. But I think
Definitely.
about where we provide guidelines and not necessarily rough policies, because I think a lot of times policies can be overinterpreted.
Completely.
And I think we're also seeing that in this space right now, which I think folks are just being really careful in terms of where are the policies that are going to take place, which we're very focused at this moment with state policies in terms of the change that they can make immediately within their states to make sure that they get the funding that will fund the completion agenda, as we describe it and talk about it at CCA, and then also lead to greater outcomes and greater opportunities within our communities, which many of those, when you're listening to kind of the public discourse, is what they have an appetite for and what they're searching for.
Completely. Yeah. I love that. I love that answer. Where do you find that college leaders just don't fully grasp the whole picture? Or if you could sort of just, like get in front and just sort of like say one or two things to college presidents, high level administrators, like what are the stories, what are the narratives, what are the pieces of the pie that you're seeing that you wish people sort of understood better?
Well, I think we have talked about who needs to be at tables and who needs to be in discussions, but we haven't fortified ways where that is always that where that becomes the norm. And so, where we're always kind of circling and saying, if we're only relying on one or two individuals to be the folks to say, I so and so should be here, or I think so such and such should be here, or this isn't represented, we're still going to miss all of the learnings that we could have from the data that we're collecting and the questions that we're asking. The other thing I talk about in terms of like just thinking about what students may miss is students want to do good for the communities. Learners want to
Yeah.
do good for the communities, and a broader swath of who we're thinking of our potential learners. I
Hmm.
think we still too narrowly, and I think some universities can afford to be narrow in their focus. We still too narrowly think about high school graduates when we really need
Yeah.
to think about folks who have just been in the ether, have some college no degree, have folks who are just as impacted, have folks who may be trying to come back in different ways. And we also have to think about the ways that people are grappling and what we're going through or continue to go through. The pandemic was a collective trauma, right? So when we think about mental health, substance abuse, and where we are, we think about, just we're seeing in terms of the polarization within our country, the lack of connectivity, the need for civic engagement. And so even just thinking about that being put into the discourse and folks being able to agree to disagree, but be able to have conversation, I think those are the things that make us better. And I think always thinking that it's a thing to do that is kind of outside of us versus it's our own internal work, I think is also the other thing that sometimes I think leaders miss. Leaders sometimes may think that they need to have all the answers. They don't. And I think they need to leave room to not be the experts and to actually learn from others. And so I think that's the bigger piece as well. And then I also want to say that we just have to make sure that our supports, our structures, our pathways match the reality of our students, of those who are trying to come on board and get a further education. And I just still there's so much work that we need to do there.
Completely agree. I've long said that I think higher education has a massive design problem. I think if you look at any, whether it's a product, a service, a community, whatever, those that have like the most uptake, the most stickiness are really centered uniquely on the needs of the users and have like feedback loops and mechanisms and design structures in place to sort of change the not just change the outcomes, but sort of change the service and delivery mechanism to truly work in a way that like works for the population. And that's something that has long been missed from higher ed, which is very sort of top down. So I feel like there's like, just to your point, there's feedback loops mechanisms, but also sort of a restructuring that can and should happen. That is so complicated, just given all the sort of intersecting parts. But for us to sort of really move to the next place, I think we really need, and that's part of what excites me about the great work that you all are doing.
I appreciate that.
Where do you find that institutions tend to get stuck, right? Because there's I think there's really sort of big ideas. There's amazing data and research that you all are sort of like forming. Where do you find that places can kind of get mired in making the transitions happen that are really effective?
Well, I think a couple of things, right? Because we think so broadly about leadership and change and culture change and what that looks like. And what I would say is what separates the movers from those who kind of continually get stuck or aren't able to do the work. I think it's alignment from the top and empowerment from on the ground, right? Like we really have to give that empowerment to the folks and give agency. We need to be aware of power dynamics in the room where we support people. So when we think about presidents, provosts, advisors, they all have to be rowing in the same direction and have bought into it. I think data transparency fuels urgency and focus, but it has to be often. And you have to feel comfortable having those conversations. Too often, sometimes when data is shared, it's seen as being punitive. And I think that's just because of how infrequently it happens. And we're not giving also the power for folks to say, well, let's think about this and let's kind of make sense of the data. Let's have an inquiry session and talk more broadly about it. I think the other thing is like and a media signal that I'm getting from presidents and provosts is like those who have start meetings with student stories and disaggregated data, right? It tells
Mhm.
us so much and reveals so much, but then that allows people to be part of those conversations. What else do you think this might mean? And what do you think this may lead us towards? What do you think the future is in terms of the ways that we're thinking about programming and offerings? And then I also think about for those who are really doing the work, they're funding and elevating implementation leaders, right? Not just like strategic leaders or strategic planners, but folks who have given a lot of their lives to this work. And so I always like to say for folks, like, for folks, there's so many folks who are already doing this work. So I just got to shout out all of those folks who are doing so much of this good work, right?
Yeah.
But it gets stagnant or it stays in silos. And so just that part where you empower everybody from the top down and people know what their role is in student success, right? When I think it was probably about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago when we started seeing the VP of student success, right? And so
Mm,
much of that was kind of bringing the student affairs, student services side, like the provost and academic student affairs and academic affairs aside back into it. And I think that is very promising, right? Because we're like, we're all in this together, but we do it in different ways. And then how do we elevate the roles of folks who are doing this work and have actually been supporting our students in so many different ways? So I always think about disability services, accessibility and accommodations. I
mm,
think about many of the centers that we have on campus, whether it's for community students or for students across different populations. I think about, our athletics folks. I think about our career explore, our career counseling folks, right? And I think about the duality of where folks have not only provided and told about the services that they're providing, but cross-train their colleagues so that they knew and there were just a dearth. And you're going to hear me say over and over again, like support, support, supports, right? Because that so much of that is so foundational to our students to helping them persist and continue on. But too much of that we kind of let go of, even though we have insights through financial aid and other means into knowing what they need. And from our faculty too, right? Early alerts have been around for a really, really, really long time. They could be used as an equity for as a lever for equity, but often it just goes beyond just maybe that one student, right? So holistically, how are they looking at that and the interventions, whether they're helping, whether they may be harming, or whether they may be more neutral. And then the last thing I'll say too is about utilization of services. Are students coming in the same way, and what are the ways in which they want to be able to self-serve, but then also sometimes be able to have that contact with that human? Regardless of how we go into this digital age, we will still need a human. And I love that our people, our students, everyone still talks about that. And so as we think about the ways that we lead in this space, even though AI and technology and so many things are kind of happening to us, where do we start co-creating that and thinking about the ways that we drive it for the problems that we see, for the solutions that we need versus letting those be dictated to us?
love that. And I think that's a great segue to you wrote this great report or co-authored a great report around sort of generating college completion. You outlined 5 different strategies for for essentially what that looks like. Can you contextualize what that is and then like where you see places perhaps getting it wrong?
Yeah, so I this larger report, and I'm pausing to say, like, I want to give a shout out to everyone who was a part of this, right? So we have our council for AI through Complete College America, right? So that is a number of folks from under-resourced institutions, APLU associations, community colleges, tribal colleges, HBCUs, and minority serving institutions, right? So folks who were kind of always put to the margins in terms of their voice or just being able to be a part of this space. And so that was very important in terms of that, those individuals who are forming our body of work and kind of keep us true to understanding and making sure that we're serving all learners. In terms of the report generating college completion, again, shout out to our consultants and colleagues on this, Audrey Ellis from T3 Advising, and then also internally, Charles Ansel is our VP of Research, Data, and Advocacy, right? And so from the report, a couple of the key learnings was just understanding that one of the most understood or misunderstood strategies is academic momentum metrics. And people think that GPA always tells the whole story, but it doesn't, right? And so one of our thing is that we just want to make sure, and we want to talk about often and everywhere as much as we can. So Mike, again, thanks for giving this space. The misinterpretation of metrics that just lead to surface level interventions. I think this with Simon Sinek, I believe it was like the why, the why, the why, the why, the why, right?
Yeah,
Like the 5 whys, how to
great.
get down a little bit deeper into what's actually taking place and the nuances. Folks will tell you that, we know it's GPA, we know this, and we know that for a really long time. But what we have not known and what we haven't surfaced are the nuances in terms of when and how and why we are still sticking to GPA as the whole story in terms of our students, in terms of their potential, and in terms of their readiness. I think other thing that we talk about is kind of structural redesign, right?
Mm,
That's bigger than just thinking about fixing students. we've seen institutions turn away from that, but we also still see folks who say and put it on the student problem with not understanding systemic barriers that come into place, right? And so we talk more broadly about, this means about creating systems that work for students and not asking students to work around broken systems. So even just something in terms of just, did a focus group not too long ago talking about dual enrollment or credit for prior learning. You go to any other institution that looks completely different. Students are waiting for these decisions to be made. Meanwhile, they have enrolled at these institutions, and then to come find out that they only get one or two or few or maybe no credits for what they have done prior. And so that's a lot of times that's a slap in the face in terms of asking them to put in so much and they get so little back. I think the other piece about this too is thinking about when we think about curriculum and what's happening within the conversations that we're having, are we actually getting those life skills and the skills that are going to serve us critical thinking, problem solving? We think about even the AI workforce infused skills. Are those happening in the classroom? And is it happening in the ways that it needs to, just across our education system and not based on funding levels, which I think is unfortunately where we kind of always seem to fall. And then when I think about structural redesign, I think the largely about that too is like humility, right? In terms of just saying, listen, this isn't, I think we have to step back from our identities, whether it's as faculty members, administrators, or expertise that we might think we have in this field to say, what if the barriers are ours and not theirs? What if we can wrap our heads around a different way of knowing or a different type of metric to track that gives us a little bit more nuance into our students? And then, we talk about the momentum that's needed for adult learners. The example we always like to say is like, we will give all of the different flexible pathways for those who've already gotten a degree. Like folks thought that coming on and offering Coursera or some of these other ones would just open up for folks to kind of learn at their own pace, especially those who maybe had not attended college. But what we found is that it's mostly those who already have degrees who are accessing those types of resources, right? And so when we think about, but then, right, what can we learn about what we're offering in these kind of executive pathways or these pathways for folks who are like graduate students? Flexible pacing, modular courses. And I go back again to talking about stackable credentials and what does that look like in terms of like, hey, if you want to come back, this is there creates and goes into a pathway for you or puts you right into an apprenticeship or into a job, right? Because we know you don't, when we think about, this is something that pains me is that increasingly we see less and less of our males going into higher education, right? And so that's a big concern for me, thinking about what is it that we're missing out there. What is it in terms of the need for so many families to get there? And we know the folks also need to earn while they learn, right? So where do we bring that into that so that that is available for folks? And then we also have to think about advisors, faculty, and others who are trained in just life staging, right? And inclusive career mapping. What could that look like in terms of when we talk more broadly about that? What's real versus these traditional, which is now non-traditional in terms of the ways that we think about mapping them to a career or moving into a field of study. And then the last thing I would say, and I think this is the thing that's really about driving change, is data transparency, right? We know across the board, and we've seen it, and I've seen it also in this role, but then across my time at other organizations, is that institutions that publicly share completion and equity gaps shift faster, right? Public dashboards, one of the biggest things to talk about, public dashboards in Indiana led to stronger advising reform statewide, right? So what does that mean when folks are sharing and interrogating and talking about that data a little bit more? It also means that they feel much more bought into the process. Because I think that's the other part about when you don't share something, whether you are acknowledging it or not, you're telling people we don't need your advice or we don't need you to look into these things. And I think, at this point in time, we see our learners, our folks who are not on their campuses right now, who are kind of peaking and just saying, where and how can I have a stake in this? Or if I don't want to be a part of that. And I think that part is very problematic and troubling as we think about the future of higher ed.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely love that answer and just the holistic sort of nature of it and all the sort of intersecting pieces. I know one thing that I've sort of seen happen quite a bit with leaders that are sort of trying to balance all the maybe sort of accreditation challenges,
Yes.
the funding challenges, the business model challenges, all these kind of things. I think they can get really sort of mired in the complexities of like what redesign looks like, and you know I think really well-intentioned people wanting to sort of move in a new direction, but sort of being stuck in
Absolutely.
a system. What would be the sort of like the low-hanging fruit first steps you'd recommend for, for a leader that like knows that they could be doing a better job and sort of like designing institutions to sort of like have better work, better transparency, being more student-centered, all those sort of really important things that you mentioned. What would be those like first like 1 to 2 steps that you say like just start here and then start digging a little bit deeper?
Yeah, so I think the thing for me would be like, let's take a look at your data, right? How broadly are you looking at it? And then do you have the ability to look at your data? What are you able to pull? I think that is the biggest piece, understanding your metrics key, your metrics tree, mapping. I feel like I'm going in kind of heavy, but I'm like mapping those metrics back to your strategic plan so folks can understand and see themselves in the work. I think that's the other part.
Yeah.
There's a couple different things. If the data isn't there and you're not able to really get some insights off the data, or if you're just reporting on data that is just that you have to report to the federal government or for accreditation, you're missing out on a lot. So expand
Yes.
that data set and invoke leaders from across your institution to say about some of the things that they would like to see, because I think there is a laundry list of folks who are trying to figure this out and are continue to do this in silos. And I think just how powerful it could be at a high end. There's one other question you asked me, but I'm going to ask you to ask it again because I think I might have missed it.
You absolutely nailed it. No, that's
Okay.
perfect.
Okay.
There's so many challenges in this space. Maybe it's a fun place to just wrap up. Like, what gets you excited about the road?
Well, you know what? I'm a person who's right in the middle thinking about AI because I think it has so much promise, but I think that there's always like a utopia or dystopian future about it. And I think the way I am, it's forcing us to change in a way that we haven't, in the ways that we measure how what we think of about student success and the length of time to get a degree. I think it's really challenging us, even though there were external pressures and different types of modalities and different types of corporate entities who were forcing us in that way too. But I also see that, folks are actually in a learning phase right now, whether they want to admit it or not, because there's so much happening and we're learning so much about our government. We're learning so much about our people. Learning so much about just the frustrations that other people have, that I feel like we're in this place where folks are like, willing to listen, I'm willing to learn, but I also want to be a part of this process and how. And I think that's the part where, we talk about Complete College America about building movements, and folks are chomping at the bit about how do I get involved? How do I make this more meaningful? What does that look like for my communities? How do I make it contextual for what is needed here and now?
Mm.
And what I love about this is that there's so many people who are increasingly lending their voices to this space or offering thoughts, opinions, and ideas. I think, when we think about, I have never liked the idea of someone saying I'm an expert, because at that point you have decided that your learning is over. And what I feel like at this point is that many of us within higher ed and then the surrounding kind of space and entities are asking some really deep questions about what does it mean to actually support an individual's life so that they can thrive? And then what does it mean in terms of what are the skills that are just very fundamental that we should be talking about and that we should be providing to our learners when and how they return to us, and what are the things that we can kind of leave off, right, and allow for them to do and think about different ways of exploring. And so what am I excited about? I'm excited about that there's a different way of just thinking about it, that there's possibilities, that there's more people brought into the work, and that there's so many people who are passionate about making it better. And so, why do I continue to be in this work? Because there's so many people like me and not like me with varied and different experiences who are giving up their minds and their space. And I think that in and of itself is like when we're all in it together, right? And that's where I'm like hopeful for that we can all be in this together to just make it a better community for ourselves and to just make better lives, so that we can be folks who can uplift others while we are uplifting ourselves.
It's a beautiful answer. I think that's a great place to end it. Meacie, thanks so much. I appreciate you. This has been a great conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.